very much welcome to today's online webinar, which is co-organized by Taiwan Study Program, TSP, and the Center for the Study of Subversion, Unconventional Interventions and Terrorism, SUIT, at School of Politics and International Relations, University of Nottingham. Our roundtable have 4 experts on Russia, Ukraine, China, and Taiwan. And the rationale for Professor Bettina Renz and myself, Chengchi Li, to start to organize and to plan this roundtable, certainly that is what we've seen, the horrible situation took place on 24th of February. Russia invaded Ukraine. And we started to think that whether we could gather our expertise and network and friends to discuss upon, of course, focus on the war in Ukraine, but also we wanted to assess, evaluate this war's implication for democracies defending the sovereignties against those authoritarian, very aggressive neighbors, and with their great power ambitions. So this is actually the main reason for us to talk about and also to welcome our panelists to discuss with us on the events and to evaluate and gauge further implication upon this. We have 45 minutes, 15 minutes panelist discussion. We focus on 4 questions and we invite 4 panelists to share their insights with us. And on this note, I think I would leave Bettina to introduce our very good 4 panelists to this event.
Thank you very much, Junie, and welcome everybody to our event today. I'm briefly going to introduce our 4 speakers. We have 4 speakers. They will all discuss with each other as well, but we have one each more or less to represent one of the 4 countries' views that we are particularly interested in. First of all, I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Professor Volodymyr Dubovyk. He is representing, of course, the Ukrainian view on the issue today. He is a professor in the Department of International Relations. He is the director of the Center for International Studies at the Mechnikov National University in Odesa in Ukraine. He is a very prolific author and scholar. He's co-author of Ukraine and European Security, which was published with Macmillan. And he has written widely on US-Ukraine relations, regional international security, and Ukraine's foreign policy. And Professor Dubovyk also has conducted a lot of international work and has had lots of international positions. He worked at the Kennan Institute, Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland, University of Washington in Seattle, and University of Texas, amongst others. So thank you very much, Volodymyr, for agreeing to speak to us today. The second speaker is Dr. Natasha Kuhrt. She is a lecturer in international peace and security in the Department of War Studies at King's College, London. And Dr. Kuhrt is an expert on Russian foreign policy and also particularly Russia-China relations. So she will particularly focus on the Russian view. Her research interests include international law, conflict and intervention, as well as a regional focus on Russian foreign and security policies, specifically with regard to Asia. She's also widely published. You can find her publication on her university website. She's also the co-convener of the British International Studies Association Working Group on Russia and Eurasian Security. Then we also have Professor Arthur Ding, who is a professor emeritus at the National Chengchi University in Taipei. He's an adjunct professor both at the NCCU and also at Taiwan's National Defense University. His research and publications focus on Chinese security, including China's security policy, China's defense, party military relations in China, as well as China's defense industry. Then last but not least, we're very pleased also to have in the round today Peter Mattis, who is a national security professional living in Washington, D.C. He previously served as the Deputy Staff Director of the Congressional-Executive Commission of China. He worked, amongst others, at the Jamestown Foundation, Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, the National Bureau of Asian Research. And Mr. Mattis also worked as a counterintelligence analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency. He has also published widely. He's the author of Analyzing the Chinese Military, a review essay and resource guide on the People's Liberation Army, and co-author of Chinese Communist Espionage and Intelligence Primer, which was published in 2019. And I'm also pointing out that Mr. Mattis today is speaking here in a personal capacity. So we have 4 broad questions that we ask each of the speakers to address briefly. We start with one of the speakers. We are hoping for a bit of a discussion between the speakers as well. So Volodymyr, if I may address the first question to you to kick off here. From your point of view and the Ukrainian point of view, what are the main drivers really that determined Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course, going back to 2014, and then in a stepped up form since February 2022?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you everyone who was involved in putting this event together. I mean, obviously these days I'm taking part in many of those, but this one stands out thematically. It's very interesting. And also, I'm really glad to be speaking to the audience here at the Nottingham University. So this is a great opportunity for me. And we are really touched here in Ukraine by all the attention to this war, this Russian aggression against Ukraine, and not just the attention, but all the support. And before I forget, and that would be definitely not fair, let me thank everyone in the audience who is British for supporting Ukraine, because the government of the United Kingdom has been really a staunch ally for us ever this invasion started. And even before that, because some of the bigger, kind of share or segment of weapons support and supply that we have received from UK came to us even before the February 24th, before the massive full-out war started, and we appreciate it, and that those were the light anti-tank weapons that been really handy and helpful and useful to Ukrainian defenders of their land. But as Bettina has mentioned, obviously the war hasn't started on February 24th. So that's a new stage. That's this massive, full-out, large-scale war that we're seeing for the last months plus. But the war actually started indeed in 2014. February of 2014, Russia then used the certain turmoil within Ukraine. We had a so-called Euromaidan, or we also call it Revolution of Dignity, when people protested against the government of President Yanukovych, and that has led to him fleeing to Russia, actually. And then there was a new election and a new government in place, and Russia has used this moment, and it looks like, for many scholars who look at this, that they have been preparing to do this for a long time, perhaps. They first moved into Crimea, and they have occupied Crimea, but they also looked further down east, and they went into Ukrainian region of Donbass, and that's how the war has started. Because with Crimea, Ukraine didn't fight back, but when the Russian troops started their war and using some of the local population as their proxy forces in Donbass, they have really started the war in earnest, and that was like April, May of 2014. That was the start of it, and the most of the fighting was in this Donbass area, the far east of Ukraine. It was limited in scope. It was a low-intensity conflict. It's never been that kinetic, really, like you have seen in the last 5 weeks or so. Also quite large scale sometimes, but most of the time low-intensity conflict, and not that many victims. I mean, obviously, it's all relative. It's been considered that about 13 to 14,000 people been victims of this stage of the conflict between February and spring of 2014 up to the February of 2022. But right now, of course, we have more victims, obviously, since the start of this massive invasion. What moved Russia to do this? First of all, they really wanted look for an opportunity to get Crimea which many of them consider their own, and they considered it as some kind of aberration for it to be part of Ukraine. Even though Russia obviously signed many treaties over years and decades recognizing Ukrainian territorial integrity and our borders, and then they violated those treaties in 2014 and ever since. But also they are looking to make Ukraine tied to Russia, and that's interesting because how you do that through violence, via violence. You know, you're using violence to make Ukraine closer to Russia. That seems contradictory, but that's seems like the thinking in Moscow went this way. We weaken Ukraine. We'll make this war a reason for Ukraine not being able to move closer to EU or NATO membership. You know, we would scare everyone in the West about intervening in this war on Ukraine's behalf, and that would make our objective, our aim of making Ukraine even more dependent on Russia and firmly placed within the sphere of influence of Russian Federation easier to achieve. That was probably the logic, and that's how it was for a number of years. But now, in a recent year or so, apparently Mr. Putin got even more on the darker side of thinking about issues. He pen and penned an article basically denying that Ukrainian nation exists, and that's nothing new to him. I mean, actually, he saw the dissolution of Soviet Union back in 1991 and publicly announced that as the largest tragedy of 20th century history in his personal life and career as well. So he was probably looking into recreating some kind of a new Russian Empire, a new Soviet Union, or something like that. You know, and then he also basically said that there's no such country as Ukraine. It's just a historical aberration. It's a strange creature, you know, that some Ukrainian lands did belong to European countries over centuries, and that's true, like Poland or Romania or Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And some of the Ukrainian lands did belong to Russian Empire in the Soviet Union. That's why he's saying, well, basically that's our land. So that's his reasoning. And also he was seeing Ukraine kind of slipping away to closer towards NATO, even without a clear membership potential for Ukraine. He saw Ukraine getting closer and closer to NATO, cooperating with NATO in many respects. Many NATO countries were helping Ukraine to put up our security system and defense system in a better capacity and so on. He's seen some presence in the Black Sea from time to time. There were battleships from NATO countries coming to the Black Sea, specifically into my hometown city, big port of Odesa. That's what he saw, and I think that all of that taken together really make him tip over the certain line and beginning this invasion, massive invasion. A lot of people consider this as a major mistake by Putin, but I mean, we'll see. Clearly, he is doing away with whatever soft power Russia has had vis-a-vis Ukraine, and he's betting now entirely on hard power, on military means and tools. There were a lot of people here in Ukraine, even since 2014, before February this year, who thought that Russia may be a friend, a big brother. They harbored some pro-Russian sentiments, but not anymore really, because most of these people actually happened to be living mostly in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, and those are exactly the lands that Russia are now hammering and basically razing to the ground and leveling some of those cities, like Kharkiv, for instance, one of the biggest cities where you had this sentiment in presence, but now obviously those people who are sitting there for more than a month under the Russian bombs and missiles, you know, they're not going to entertain any idea of Russia being friendly or friendly power anymore. So the choice has been made in Moscow to use hard power and military tools to make Ukraine weaker and make it suffer and inflict the maximum pain. And there you have it. There you have a shelling of civilian buildings, hospitals, schools, and so on. Basically, for the last several weeks, there haven't been much of direct military-to-military combat. The focus of Russian military activities have been shelling buildings and infrastructure that had nothing to do with military capacity of Ukraine. But they want to undermine Ukraine. You want to make Ukraine weaker. They also bombing our, industrial base, and now started bombing railway system. They are targeting a lot of targets around Ukraine with their missiles. They can reach, they have the capacity to reach any target within Ukraine, or even beyond, for that matter, beyond Ukraine if they want to. And they target oil reservoirs, for instance, oil refineries and so on. So The idea, I guess, to make Ukraine weaker. And of course, we're getting a lot of support now from our allies and friends around the world, not just in the West, but also other countries joining. And that's important to us, but that's a big struggle. I mean, obviously, in the last few days, we've been living under the shock of Bucha and other places in Ukraine. There are many Buchas, I'm afraid, where we discover now that under Russian occupation, there have been terrible and massive, summarily executions of civilians taking place. You know, who was singled out? Was it accidental victims, or were they actually people who were known in their local towns for having pro-Ukrainian possession? We still don't know. There needs to be an investigation. There'll be a discussion today in the Security Council of the United Nations, and actually President Zelensky of Ukraine will talk and address the session of Security Council today. So we'll see what happens. But obviously, we're having tons of war crimes, unfortunately, and big losses. And before I give the floor to everyone else on the panel, I would also say that, of course, the role of China is huge here, because if China decides to take Russia's part, that's going to be a difficult situation for Ukraine. But luckily enough, so far, we don't see any reasons to believe that China is going to be helping Ukraine, Russia militarily, sending troops or sending weapons. They're helping them in terms of their propaganda efforts, because if you listen to Chinese media, state media, it's all the West's fault. You know, Russia is not Russia's fault what's happening. And they call to the peace and for the dialogue, and forgetting to mention who started the war, who's waging the war, who's an aggressor, who's a victim. But at least they're not helping Russia militarily so far, and they're helping them economically, obviously buying a lot of Russian, energy resources and so on. There could be maybe many parallels drawn between situation between Ukraine and Russia and then Taiwan and China, because also I think it's a bigger civilizational struggle. Ukraine is choosing and striving for democracy, maybe imperfect one, but that's our orientation, that's our expectation, that we would want to be a better democracy and moving that way, while Russia is moving in a different opposite direction. Not only authoritarian, but now becoming more and more a totalitarian country. I think some might see the similar dynamics showing themselves, presenting themselves in the China-Taiwan relations. There could be more. There could be interesting discussion to be had about the role of the international actors, third parties, like, for instance, now a bunch of countries helping Ukraine. Will the allies of Taiwan be able and willing to help Taiwan if needs to be, if it comes under some kind of attack from China? So that's another interesting topic, I think, to be discussed. So finally, I should say it's a big struggle here in Ukraine, and I think it's a struggle not just for Ukrainian people. For us, it's existential, because basically we are seeing Mr. Putin trying to do away with the very notion of Ukrainians. But for everyone else in the world, I think it should be also about their values and principles in the future world they want to live in. Is it going to be this world of jungles where predators, when they're hungry, they do whatever they like to the smaller countries? Or would that actually be some kind of a more fair and just international world order? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Volodymyr. And I'm sure there will be lots of questions later on also for you about especially current events and so on, and the war and the various aspects that you have mentioned. Since you already sort of made that bridge over to the China dimension, maybe Natasha, if I could give you, to me, if that's okay, the second question to start to kick off with. So. How do you see the Russia and China partnership, and what are the implications of the war in Ukraine for this partnership? And obviously also you can also speak to the first question as well, and then the other panelists. Thanks.
Thank you, Bettina. Quite a lot to address in 3 minutes, but I think Volodymyr has already kind of given us quite a lot of detail about the Russian motivation, if you like, for invading Ukraine. Obviously, Russia over the years has given a multiplicity of different justifications, which of course we don't necessarily take on board, but it can be interesting to look at the nature of those justifications, which have ranged from kind of international legal justifications, quite detailed actually, legal justifications based on the ICJ advisory opinion on Kosovo Declaration of Independence, the ruling in 2010, ranging from that to the ruling on Quebec. So it's kind of interesting in the sense that initially Russia did kind of try, even if we don't accept those legal arguments, it tried to build kind of very much a legal argumentation back in 2014, in a way mirroring to some extent the justification that was given for recognizing Kosovo as a state. But then it kind of moved at a certain point from these kind of legal justifications into very much emotional, historical kind of justifications, linked also to the demise of the Soviet Union. And I think at one point Putin said, I heard residents of Crimea say in 1991 that they were handed over like a sack of potatoes. And the Russian state accepted the situation, and they kind of appealed then to this sort of historical memory, obviously only going back a couple of hundred years to the time of Catherine the Great and so on, and not really addressing the fact that, of course, many non-Russians had also been living in Crimea. So, of course, we don't take what Putin says at face value, but there are certain justifications which are kind of trotted out, sometimes for an international audience, sometimes for the domestic Russian audience. And we see that time and again now. Russian television, of course, very much kind of feeding the Russian population certain kind of narratives about what's going on in Ukraine. Obviously, this is all very much fake news. But if we think that in Russia this kind of news has been kind of disseminated since 2014, regarding Ukraine and the kind of limited sovereignty, if you like, of Ukraine, the kind of lack of legitimacy in Russia's view that Ukraine has to sovereignty, as I think Volodymyr noted. And, actually, I would say that that kind of attitude is also evident when you look at other countries, in the neighborhood of Russia. I've been at conferences where, Russians have talked about Kazakhstan as if it's not a real country, So it's not exclusive to Ukraine, but obviously, Ukraine is a country that's subject to Russian military invasion. So regarding Russia-China, it's interesting to see how long it took China to actually respond to the invasion. It clearly was, taking a while to formulate its response. And I guess you could argue that this is quite a critical time for China in terms of the way in which it has positioned itself as this kind of, tried to position itself as a kind of global responsible power. It's become much more active within UN peacekeeping, for example. Obviously it has a lot of economic interests in Africa, and as many of these peacekeeping operations, for example, are on the African continent, it behoves China to participate in these operations. But also, I think, in terms of China's kind of image, if you like, it has been, trying to sort of engage much more with these kinds of operations. China is one of the biggest contributors of troops, as well as one of the biggest financial contributors to UN peacekeeping, which is quite interesting because it's actually the only one of the P5, who is a financial contributor and a troop contributor. And so China's kind of profile has been very much about sort of, positioning itself in this way, also as a kind of provider of public economic goods, of global economic goods, obviously with the BRI. And we should remember at this point as well that, of course, China had quite good relations with Ukraine. I don't know if Volodymyr and others want to talk about that later. And so I think already in 2014, we can see that China was not entirely happy about the annexation of Crimea and the sense in which it might disrupt economic relations with Ukraine. But I think this is a testing time for China in the sense that, if China kind of mirrors the sort of Russian depiction of this war as a kind of proxy war, if you like, between Russia and the West, right? So that's the way I think that China is depicting it as well. And so also for China, then the outcome of this war will be quite decisive in the sense that, should Russia lose, it kind of looks as if China's been backing the wrong horse, let's say. But it also might have implications, of course, for the way in which the West might react were China to mount its own invasion of Taiwan, which I think we're coming back to that topic later on. And so I think that this, although we can speculate until the cows come home about the extent to which Putin had actually told Xi about the plans for the invasion, we don't know. I'm sure that something was imparted to Xi, but I'm not sure that that Russia would have told China about the kind of full extent of this war. So I think that for China, this is a very difficult moment, and of course, China's talked about mediating in this war, but actually, it's really done very little at all. Although what it has done is that it hasn't really shown any explicit support for Russia. On the other hand, it has repeated that narrative about, the kind of fake news about the biolabs and so on and so forth. And so the idea of this being a partnership with no limits, as the two set out at the Olympic opening ceremony, I think there clearly are limits to this relationship.
Thank you, Natasha. I think I just follow Bettina as originally we wanted panelists to talk about 4 questions, but also in the interest of time, and also Natasha, you already actually touched upon the connection of the aggressive big power, China and Russia's, their intention, and you focus on the different perspective of China's BRI, China's engagement with African countries. I will again then welcome our panelists if you wanted to chip in more, maybe in a little while later, but I now also give the time to our 3rd question, and I would like to invite Peter to share with us your thought about, with all following what Natasha just provided, her suggestions and observation on China's movements, if you like. What does that more specifically, the war in Ukraine, the implication on the China's calculation specifically on Taiwan? So Peter, your time, please, then.
First, thank you, Professor Lee and Professor Renz for having me and for organizing this event. I'll just make a quick comment on the China and Russia relationship. For the last 2 decades, this is a relationship that's been talked about in its limits, and in terms of its limits, it is important to recognize those. But we should also recognize that the way that China works with its partner countries is not necessarily the way the US or the UK or NATO countries work with alliance partners. So the diplomacy and the tactics and the approach are different. And one of the factors that's been repeatedly cited as driving the Russia and China relationship is a shared perception of threat from the United States and from the democratic world, that these are pushing dangerous ideas that have to be prevented from coming in. And if you look at the rhetoric of the foreign policy of the United States, and you look at it from the European countries, right, we've increasingly framed things in the context of democracy versus autocracy, in a kind of crusade or a larger sort of moral competition. That doesn't lower the threat perception, right, from China and Russia, right? That puts it into a bit of an all or nothing kind of framing, or at least given the way that at least China and the Chinese Communist Party perceives those threats in this much larger struggle. So it's worth remembering that this is not something that, if a shared threat perception of the United States and of the democratic world is something that's driven them together and is the basis of their relationship. This is a basis and a foundation that's actually getting stronger rather than weaker as time goes on. If I were to pick a few lessons for China coming out of this conflict, the first is that they should be quite cautious in drawing lessons. We're a little more than a month in to the latest iteration, and it may still be early to see what the staying power is in terms of what European countries are prepared to do, what the United States is prepared to do, and the limits of that support. Although it appears the military situation is moving in one direction, right? War is a complicated, difficult thing, and we don't have a good vision of where the conflict will go. And if I were in the People's Liberation Army, I would simply be cautious in waiting and seeing what it is, and then think about how to gather information on the military conflict afterwards in quite a rapid fashion. And this is a sort of intellectual muscle that the PLA has developed, and they spent a great deal of time studying the Gulf War, the interventions in the former Yugoslavia, and looking for the way that countries fight and the lessons for modern warfare. But first would be cautious. The second lesson, I think, for Xi Jinping, for the PLA, is that if they're going to launch an invasion of Taiwan, if they're going to attack, you have to go fast, you have to go hard. And it's not a time to get fancy with thinking that a decapitation strike is going to fix it, that special forces can fix it, or that anything. The risk of giving a presentation from home, but that this it's not simply an area to be fancy. That if they're going to go, they need to go fast, and as fast as possible, because the support that Taiwan is likely to get internationally is going to be related to how long it resists. Given the estimates that are now out there of what democratic countries thought were sort of Ukraine's timetable for resisting, that this might be over in 72, 96 hours, or maybe just a little bit longer. The fact that Ukraine lasted through that first weekend is probably had an impact on the amount of support that started coming and the time for those tools to be engaged. So the longer Taiwan holds, the more support it's likely to get. The third, on the cautionary tale, again, is that combined arms is difficult. Things like suppressing air defense and missiles is incredibly difficult to do. To try to find light infantry is incredibly difficult to do when you're fighting in unfamiliar territory. And yes, the PLA has been training for some of these things, but we don't necessarily have a good view to be able to make a clear judgment about how good they are at putting these pieces together. Is this, I think this is one of the lessons from Russian military analysts looking at this. Who could have predicted that the Russian military would not fight the way that it's supposedly trained, right? Is the PLA something like the Russian military, or is it better in training the way that it's actually going to fight? The fourth lesson, I think, is that plans don't survive first contact, and that there has to be some adaptability in this, because there are so many different things when you think about the complexity of invading a country 110 miles away. Sure, like that this is going to be something that's difficult. It will require a lot of coordination It will require a lot of movement in and out of ports. It will require a lot of deconfliction of different PLA units, whether they're in the rocket forces, whether they're the Air Force or PLA Navy aviation. And Xi Jinping, whatever his merits, is not Mao Zedong. He is not Deng Xiaoping in terms of his experience and his close relationship to the use of force and for political purposes, right? When you look back at how the PRC has used military force as a political tool, this was something that was generally tailored and generally focused on political ends. But leaders like Mao and Deng were intimately familiar with what the military tool was. And Xi Jinping does not quite have that same experience. And so if he is wiser than he appears, I think he should be cautious about how difficult it is to execute a plan and what it's going to look like in this environment. And lastly, I think the PRC should be very cautious about the potential unity of European democracies, Australia, Japan, the United States, because the capacity that has been demonstrated for unity in the last month is quite striking and arguably something that would have been difficult to predict at the beginning of February. Yeah. And I'll end it there.
We have one final question, of course, which is a big question where we would all like all of the speakers to say something, but we will ask Arthur Ding to lead it, which is then about what Ukraine and Taiwan and countries in similar situations can do to protect their sovereignty against neighbors with great power ambition. So Chunyi, I'll pass over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Bettina. So Professor Ding, then I think we sort of tend to see what would be the reaction, what can the democracies do as Taiwan and Ukraine to counter these great, ambitious, aggressive, authoritarian powers. So, I mean, in a sense that we started with Volodymyr's good reflection and observation of what has happened in Ukraine. And if we may, to consult your observation and suggestion to see what can Taiwan foresee us hopefully not to be into these real security conflicts. And as Peter just provided his observation that if he is on a clever side, which we hope he is, should be very cautious. But nonetheless, I still would wish to, and I think our audience would like to hear from your observations and input about Taiwan's reflection during this horrific war scenario in Ukraine.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank for the invitation. But again, I also want to apologize that I really cannot manage Microsoft Teams quite well. So back to the question is pretty tough, I would say. But I think the Russia's invasion of the Ukraine give us a fact that this is a whole different war already. And on the one side, we see democratic oriented country, and on the other side, we see the so-called authoritarian regime-oriented governments. And these two groups compete each other, particularly the second group led by China. So I think this is a whole different war already. On the one side, we see the so-called democratic war. So Taiwan, no doubt, is in the democratic side since 1990s. So what we should do and what we can learn from the Russia's invasion. So first of all, I will emphasize that probably the leading power in the democratic bloc or groups have to show its determination and the resolution to resist whatever temptation or ambition against these democratic neighbors. So I think that the leading democratic countries should learn this lesson from the Russia's invasion. Second is about the I think both there's a similarity between Ukraine and Taiwan. We call it transitional justice. In Ukraine, we see a small portion of the Russian people living in the new Ukraine. And in Taiwan, we all know that the so-called those people join KMT or join the Chiang Kai-shek coming to Taiwan after 1949. So we have so-called identity crisis or identity cleavage somewhere in both Taiwan and Ukraine, and probably in many of the other developing countries. So I would say the leadership has to handle this kind of identity crisis or identity cleavage very prudently and carefully. First is that we probably need to improve our governance. What I mean governance that probably to make people feel that this is the place where I live, and this is the place I should fight for it. There's no doubt Taiwan in the past 45, 50 years has grown substantially. And in terms of so-called income, average income, and health, so on and so forth. So this is what we pretty value about it. And I think all the other the developed countries in the neighboring countries of the authoritarian regimes should also try to improve their governance as much as possible. I know it's very tough because identity cleavage probably can serve as kind of a barrier or block. But I think this is the leadership. As long as you are leadership, this is your job to improve the so-called governance, so that the people can feel that we are the people. We are together. You know? So I think the further that I think the Ukraine case gives us a lesson that once the strong so-called authoritarian neighbor want to have some kind of ambitions, then we need to show our will and the resolution and the determination to resist whatever potential invasion or ambitions, so that this kind of a resolution or the determination can dissuade, I would say, the authoritarian neighbor from taking kind of actions. And as Peter said that, as long if we can resist as long as possible, then we'll get the support from the other democratic countries. So I think those are some kind of action lessons we learned. In addition to that, these days in Taiwan, we watch the development in Ukraine extremely carefully and closely, and we also learn some. For instance, previous certain group of people on Taiwan, they have kind of a belief or illusion that the U.S. may come to aid for Taiwan if China launch invasion. But if we look at the what happened in Ukraine, the U.S. did not send the force to Ukraine. Instead, U.S. sent arms, provide arms to Ukraine, and also strengthen force to the NATO members. So so many people in Taiwan, we see this kind of effect, and they gradually correct their so-called illusions, and fully realize that it should be our own, rely on ourselves to resist potential or to resist the China's possible military actions. And also, we also learn as kind of a lesson that we have seems consensus been reached that our military service should be extended from 4 months to maybe to 10 months or 1 year. So those are the debate and some kind of a consensus we have reached in the past more than 1 month, as we see the war in Ukraine closely, and it's in our all kind of media discussion every day. So we spend tremendous time to discuss, to debate, and to watch what happened in Ukraine. So those are my points, and let me stop here now.
Thank you, Professor Ding. May I invite all panelists, all 3 panelists, if you wanted to reflect upon the fourth question, democracy's strength to fight back of the authoritarian, aggressive neighbor. Any short, brief reflection if you wanted to add on, chip in?
Yeah, well, I guess I alluded to this already a little bit in my short presentation in the beginning, but I can elaborate a little more because the fight for us, it is about democracy and freedom and sovereignty and human rights and all those things. So, of course, it is a fight for territorial integrity, for us to stay on as a nation state, an independent one. It's an existential fight in many ways. And this is a big fight which actually presents us with some threats and challenges in terms of keeping our democratic nature. Because in a wartime situation, obviously, it's not a very conducive situation for democratizing, further democratizing, because well, it requires strong power, strong central authority, hierarchy of power, immediate, kind of execution of decisions being made to the center, many other things. So it's not good for any discussion, for instance, like what we do next, because we need to do it right now. It's a, like I said, it's an existential threat. So it's actually a challenge. Right now, for instance, our government, they are not being seen as abusing the trust of the people. We are one and together in many ways. It's absolutely unseen in Ukrainian contemporary history, closeness of the government on one hand and the people, rest of the people on the other. We've never been so close. I mean, no one ever had any ratings like Zelensky is having right now. And he had quite low ratings, our president, before the war. But now he is, skyrocketing. I mean, it's 90+% of the public trust. So, but it presents him with opportunity maybe to move in a certain way, undemocratic way. Hopefully he wouldn't, and he will not going to heed and listen to the populace, and we might work something out. But the fight that we're waging is for democracy, because we want to have free elections, we want to have free press, we want to have all those things that Russia didn't have. I want to be an Ukrainian professor. I want to be still able to express my position and my opinions freely without any fear of persecution, which was the case for years and years and still is in Ukraine. And that's what we're fighting for. I mean, a lot of my Russian friends, they really need to watch closely for years now what they're saying publicly. There is a huge difference between Russian scholars being based in the West and they can present freely at the conferences, and those Russian colleagues, unfortunately, who are based in Russia, and they have to be very careful in what they're saying, or whether presenting in Russia or outside of Russia, because they've been watched. So that's something that is worth fighting for, and for a lot of Ukrainians it's like this. We're a democratic country, that Zelensky won in a landslide under the wartime situation already in 2019. Mr. Poroshenko, previous president, he wasn't happy about losing, definitely not in a landslide, but he didn't have any choice. He left, okay, so he became an opposition. And right now, actually, in the wartime, he is pretty much limiting and restraining his criticism of what Zelensky is doing, because first of all, he's supported across the board, and second of all, it's war on. So you shouldn't really be criticizing the government when they're, conducting the war. So it's interesting in terms of the freedom of elections. That's really something we value, we cherish. We had two Maidans. I mean, Ukrainians were seen as a super patient people until 2004, and putting up with all sorts of undemocratic behavior from previous President Kuchma, who was president for 10 years between 1994 and 2004. But then all of a sudden we gained a different reputation with two Maidans, one in 2004 and another one 10 years later, when Ukrainians just basically protested in massive numbers against the wrongs by the government, and all of a sudden we've earned this kind of model nation reputation, on the contrary, of someone who is willing to stand up for their rights. And this war is continuation of that struggle in many ways. Yes, we want to be keeping our choices free. We want to be able to make our choices about the future of our foreign policy orientation. Right now there is terrible, very strong pressure on us, making this kind of neutrality, non-alignment status choice under pressure. But at the same time, at least we would like to keep our choices and our perspective in terms of joining EU in some time in the future open, and open doors for EU as well. So yes, for us, the struggle, it's a military struggle, it's an existential struggle, but it's just a struggle for our homes and our families. But at the same time, it's also very much values-based fight that we're having right now. And I hope that through fighting this war, if it becomes even longer and more protracted, we wouldn't lose this democratic, values-based side of our people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's the war to fight on, for sure. And we've seen a lot, a very harsh and brave fighting. At what cost? This is the question, right? At what cost? And this is a constant discussion between Bettina and myself, that at what cost that the world we're seeing, witness is going on. Natasha and Peter, do you want to chip in for some short comments before Bettina open the floor?
Yeah, I'll just make a couple of comments, which are, unfortunately, we allowed the annexation to happen in 2014, and this was kind of presented by Russia as a sort of, the polite green men, kind of a sort of war without casualties and so on. And then what was happening in eastern Ukraine was largely under the radar. If you wanted to find out about it, you could, but we didn't really pay it much attention in the West. And we, from Putin's point of view, 2008, Georgia, essentially membership action plan for Georgia is dropped. And then 2014, in a way, we've kind of accepted a de facto annexation of Crimea by Russia. So in many ways, I feel that Putin was emboldened by our lack of action. And I hope that the kind of wishful thinking that goes on amongst many people in the West, that this war will come to an end soon without the West having to really take any further action. I worry that, then we will see a Ukraine that, has to essentially give away or give up on eastern Ukraine and Crimea in order for this war to come to an end. So I think it's very important that we send out the right signals to Ukraine. I won't speak about Taiwan. Obviously, in international legal terms, Taiwan is a de facto state. So it's a slightly different issue in a way. And obviously, most states sign up to that one China policy. But Ukraine, it's a member of the United Nations and so on. And, it has already been carved up. So we need to think very carefully, and there is strong unity in the West, but how long will that unity last? I hope it will last. But, because as we know, different members of the EU, for example, are dependent on Russian energy and so on in different ways. Everyone's kind of accepted they're going to take a hit on that. But, some countries may find it harder in the longer term than others. So, I do hope that we can kind of, hold out. So I'll try to remain optimistic.
Sure. Peter, would you wanted to chip in some short-term comments? Yeah.
Some very quick comments on the lessons for Taiwan. I think the first is that there's no substitute for a well-trained, well-equipped military in terms of defending and sustaining the independence. The second is that Taiwan should make sure that it's got both the intelligence capability and the relationships to distribute that intelligence worldwide. As a crisis develops or a potential invasion develops, the ability to provide persuasive evidence of what is taking place and on Chinese decision-making in Beijing or in the Eastern Theater Command, where decisions are going to be taking place, will be a critical adjunct for Taiwan to help build the story about what is taking place, that this is a war of aggression, and that it is about the suppression of what is a de facto sovereign state. Third would be that it has to ready its people and its country for a conflict like this. They have to be prepared. They have to accept that this may be coming. And I recognize that this is an issue in Taiwan that some are much more optimistic about than perhaps they once were. And it also means thinking about the fundamentals like energy, food, water, to be able to sustain the population. And this leads to the last point, which is Ukraine is not Taiwan in terms of the ability to provide supplies from the outside. There are no overland routes. It is not targeting, it's not striking inside NATO territory to hit supplies that would be going into Taiwan. So thinking about what has to be protected and stockpiled, and what are ways that supplies could get through to Taiwan, I think is the last lesson or sort of the big question that Taiwanese should be working on.
Thank you, Peter. That's really a crucial point that we are all considering, especially Taiwan surrounded by sea rather than land.